In this video, we're plunging into 3 unforgettable Agatha Christie tales, where secrets lie in wait and deception reigns supreme. A mysterious will vanishes without a trace, leaving a fortune and a trail of lies behind it. A prestigious club hides a dark secret, and a simple hunting trip takes a shocking turn when an unexpected death leads to a web of confusion and betrayal. Get ready for mind-bending twists, shocking revelations, and a race against time to uncover the truth. Trust me, you won't see the shocking endings coming. Stick with us until the very end. You won't believe what happens next.
The Arcadian deer is part of Agatha Christie's The Labours of Hercules collection, where each story is inspired by one of the classical labours of Hercules. In this story, Christie draws a parallel between the mythological tale of capturing the Ceryneian hind and Poirot's search for the elusive Nita. The original myth involves Hercules capturing a sacred deer, a task that required both patience and respect for the creature. Similarly, Poirot's task is to find and understand a woman who, like the deer, represents something unattainable and ethereal. The story reflects Christie's ability to weave classical themes into modern detective fiction, enriching the narrative with deeper symbolism. Agatha Christie, The Arcadian Deer. Hercule Poirot stamped his feet, seeking to warm them. He blew upon his fingers. Flakes of snow melted and dripped from the corners of his moustache. There was a knock at the door, and a chambermaid appeared. She was a slow-breathing, thick-set country girl, and she stared with a good deal of curiosity at Hercule Poirot. It was possible that she had never seen anything quite like him before. She asked, "Did you ring?" "I did. Will you be so good as to light the fire?" She went out and came back again immediately with paper and sticks. She knelt down in front of the big Victorian grate and began to lay a fire. Hercule Poirot continued to stamp his feet, swing his arms, and blow on his fingers. He was annoyed. His car, an expensive Messaro Graz, had not behaved with that mechanical perfection which he expected of a car. His chauffeur, a young man who enjoyed a handsome salary, had not succeeded in putting things right. The car had staged a final refusal in a secondary road 1.5 miles from anywhere with a fall of snow beginning. Hercule Poirot, wearing his usual patent leather shoes, had been forced to walk that 1.5 miles to reach the riverside village of Hartley Dean, a village which, though showing every sign of animation in summertime, was completely moribund in winter. The Black Swan had registered something like dismay at the arrival of a guest. The landlord had been almost eloquent, as he pointed out that the local garage could supply a car in which the gentleman could continue his journey. Hercule Poirot repudiated the suggestion. His Latin thrift was offended. Hire a car. He already had a car, a large car, an expensive car. In that car and no other, he proposed to continue his journey back to town. And, in any case, even if repairs to it could be quickly effected, he was not going on in this snow until next morning. He demanded a room, a fire, and a meal. Sighing, the landlord showed him to the room, sent the maid to supply the fire, and then retired to discuss with his wife the problem of the meal. An hour later, his feet stretched out towards the comforting blaze, Hercule Poirot reflected leniently on the dinner he had just eaten. True, the steak had been both tough and full of gristle, the Brussels sprouts had been large, pale, and definitely watery, the potatoes had had hearts of stone. Nor was there much to be said for the portion of stewed apple and custard which had followed. The cheese had been hard, and the biscuits soft. Nevertheless, thought Hercule Poirot, looking graciously at the leaping flames, and sipping delicately at a cup of liquid mud euphemistically called coffee, it was better to be full than empty, and after tramping snow-bound lanes in patent leather shoes, to sit in front of a fire was paradise. There was a knock on the door, and the chambermaid appeared. "Please, sir, the man from the garage is here and would like to see you." Hercule Poirot replied amiably, "Let him mount." The girl giggled and retired. Poirot reflected kindly that her account of him to her friends would provide entertainment for many winter days to come. There was another knock, a different knock, and Poirot called, "Come in." He looked up with approval at the young man who entered and stood there looking ill at ease, twisting his cap in his hands. Here, he thought, was one of the handsomest specimens of humanity he had ever seen, a simple young man with the outward semblance of a Greek god. The young man said in a low, husky voice, "About the car, sir. We've brought it in, and we've got at the trouble. It's a matter of an hour's work or so." Poirot said, "What is wrong with it?" The young man plunged eagerly into technical details. Poirot nodded his head gently, but he was not listening. Perfect physique was a thing he admired greatly. There were, he considered, too many rats in spectacles about. He said to himself approvingly, "Yes, a Greek god, a young shepherd in Arcady." The young man stopped abruptly. It was then that Hercule Poirot's brows knitted themselves for a second. His first reaction had been aesthetic, his second mental. His eyes narrowed themselves curiously as he looked up. He said, "I comprehend. Yes, I comprehend." He paused and then added, "My chauffeur, he has already told me that which you have just said." He saw the flush that came to the other's cheek, saw the fingers grip the cap nervously. The young man stammered, "Yes, yes, sir, I know." Hercule Poirot went on smoothly, "But you thought that you would also come and tell me yourself?" Yes, sir, I thought I'd better." "That," said Hercule Poirot, "was very conscientious of you. Thank you." There was a faint but unmistakable note of dismissal in the last words, but he did not expect the other to go, and he was right. The young man did not move. His fingers moved convulsively, crushing the tweed cap, and he said in a still lower, embarrassed voice, Excuse me, sir, but it's true, isn't it, that you're the detective gentleman, you're Mr. Hercules Poirot?" He said the name carefully. Poirot said, "That is so." Red crept up the young man's face. He said, "I read a piece about you in the paper." "Yes?" The boy was now scarlet. There was distress in his eyes, distress and appeal. Hercule Poirot came to his aid. He said gently, "Yes. What is it you want to ask me?" The words came with a rush now. "I'm afraid you may think it's awful cheek of me, sir, but your coming here by chance like this, well, it's too good to be missed. Having read about you and the clever things you've done. Anyway, I said as after all I might as well ask you. There's no harm in asking, is there?" Hercule Poirot shook his head. He said, "You want my help in some way?" The other nodded. He said, his voice husky and embarrassed, It's about a young lady. If you could find her for me—" "Find her? Has she disappeared, then?" "That's right, sir." Hercule Poirot sat up in his chair. He said sharply, "I could help you, perhaps, yes. But the proper people for you to go to are the police. It is their job, and they have far more resources at their disposal than I have." The boy shuffled his feet. He said awkwardly, "I couldn't do that, sir. It's not like that at all. It's all rather peculiar, so to speak." Hercule Poirot stared at him. Then he indicated a chair. "Eh bien, then sit down. What is your name?" "Williamson, sir, Ted Williamson." "Sit down, Ted, and tell me all about it." "Thank you, sir." He drew forward the chair and sat down carefully on the edge of it. His eyes had still that appealing dog-like look. Hercule Poirot said gently, "Tell me." Ted Williamson drew a deep breath. "Well, you see, sir, it was like this. I never saw her but the once, and I don't know her right name nor anything. But it's queer-like, the whole thing, and my letter coming back and everything." "Start," said Hercule Poirot, "at the beginning. Do not hurry yourself. Just tell me everything that occurred." "Yes, sir." "Well, perhaps you know Grass Lawn, sir, that big house down by the river past the bridge?" "I know nothing at all." "Belongs to Sir George Sanderfield, it does. He uses it in the summer-time for weekends and parties. Rather a gay lot he has down as a rule. Actresses and that. Well, it was last June, and the wireless was out of order, and they sent me up to see to it." Poirot nodded. So I went along. The gentleman was out on the river with his guests, and the cook was out, and his manservant had gone along to serve the drinks and all that on the launch. There was only this girl in the house. She was the lady's maid to one of the guests. She let me in and showed me where the set was and stayed there while I was working on it. And so we got to talking and all that. Nita her name was, so she told me, and she was lady's maid to a Russian dancer who was staying there. What nationality was she, English? No, sir, she'd be French, I think. She'd a funny sort of accent. But she spoke English all right. She was friendly, and after a bit I asked her if she could come out that night and go to the pictures, but she said her lady would be needing her. But then she said as how she could get off early in the afternoon, because as how they wasn't going to be back off the river till late. So the long and the short of it was that I took the afternoon off without asking, and nearly got the sack for it too, and we went for a walk along by the river. He paused. A little smile hovered on his lips. His eyes were dreamy. Poirot said gently, "And she was pretty, yes? She was just the loveliest thing you ever saw. Her hair was like gold. It went up each side like wings, and she had a gay kind of way of tripping along. I fell for her right away, sir. I'm not pretending anything else." Poirot nodded. The young man went on, "She said as how her lady would be coming down again in a fortnight, and we fixed up to meet again then." He paused. "But she never came. I waited for her at the spot she'd said, but not a sign of her, and at last I made bold to go up to the house and ask for her. The Russian lady was staying there all right, and her maid too, they said. Sent for her they did. But when she came, why, it wasn't Nita at all. Just a dark, catty-looking girl, a bold lot if there ever was one. Marie, they called her. You want to see me? She says, simpering all over. She must have seen I was took aback. I said, was she the Russian lady's maid, and something about her not being the one I'd seen before, and then she laughed and said that the last maid had been sent away sudden. Sent away? I said. What for? She sort of shrugged her shoulders and stretched out her hands. How should I know? She said. I was not there. Well, sir, it took me aback. At the moment I couldn't think of anything to say, but afterwards I plucked up courage and I got to see this Marie again and asked her to get me Nita's address. I didn't let on to her that I didn't even know Nita's last name. I promised her a present if she did what I asked. She was the kind as wouldn't do anything for you for nothing. Well, she got it all right for me. An address in North London it was, and I wrote to Nita there. But the letter came back after a bit, sent back through the post office with no longer at this address scrawled on it. Ted Williamson stopped. His eyes, those deep blue, steady eyes, looked across at Poirot. He said, You see how it is, sir? It's not a case for the police. But I want to find her, and I don't know how to set about it. If you could find her for me. His colour deepened. I've a bit put by. I could manage £5, or even 10. Poirot said gently, We need not discuss the financial side for the moment. First, reflect on this point. This girl, this Nita. She knew your name and where you worked. Oh, yes, sir. Sir. She could have communicated with you if she had wanted to? Ted said more slowly. Yes, sir. Then do you not think, perhaps— Ted Williamson interrupted him. What you're meaning, sir, is that I fell for her, but she didn't fall for me. Maybe that's true in a way, but she liked me. She did like me. It wasn't just a bit of fun to her. And I've been thinking, sir, as there might be a reason for all this. You see, sir, it was a funny crowd she was mixed up in. She might be in a bit of trouble, if you know what I mean. You mean she might have been going to have a child? Your child? Not mine, sir. Ted flushed. There wasn't nothing wrong between us. Poirot looked at him thoughtfully. He murmured, And if what you suggest is true, you still want to find her. The colour surged up in Ted Williamson's face. He said, Yes, I do, and that's flat. I want to marry her if she'll have me, and that's no matter what kind of a jam she's in, if you'll only try and find her for me, sir. Hercule Poirot smiled. He said, murmuring to himself, Hair like wings of gold. Yes, I think this is the third labour of Hercules. If I remember rightly, that happened in Arcady. Hercule Poirot looked thoughtfully at the sheet of paper on which Ted Williamson had laboriously inscribed a name and address. Miss Valletta, 17 Upper Renfrew Lane, N15. He wondered if he would learn anything at that address. Somehow he fancied not. But it was the only help Ted could give him. Number 17. Upper Renfrew Lane was a dingy but respectable street. A stout woman with bleary eyes opened the door to Poirot's knock. Miss Valletta? Gone away a long time ago, she has. Poirot advanced a step into the doorway just as the door was about to close. You can give me, perhaps, her address? Couldn't say, I'm sure. She didn't leave one. When did she go away? Last summer it was. Can you tell me exactly when? A gentle clinking noise came from Poirot's right hand, where two half-crowns jostled each other in friendly fashion. The bleary-eyed woman softened in an almost magical manner. She became graciousness itself. Well, I'm sure I'd like to help you, sir. Let me see now. August, no. Before that, July. Yes, July it must have been. About the first week in July. Went off in a hurry, she did. Back to Italy, I believe. She was an Italian, then? That's right, sir. And she was at one time lady's maid to a Russian dancer, was she not? That's right. Madame Semolina or some such name. Danced at the Thespian in this ballet everyone's so wild about. One of the stars, she was. Poirot said, Do you know why Miss Valletta left her post? The woman hesitated a moment before saying, I couldn't say, I'm sure. She was dismissed, was she not? Well, I believe there was a bit of a dust-up. But mind you, Miss Valletta didn't let on much about it. She wasn't one to give things away. But she looked wild about it. Wicked temper she had, real Italian, her black eyes all snapping and looking as if she'd like to put a knife into you. I wouldn't have crossed her when she was in one of her moods. And you are quite sure you do not know Miss Valletta's present address? The half-crowns clinked again encouragingly. The answer rang true enough. I wish I did, sir. I'd be only too glad to tell you. But there. She went off in a hurry, and there it is. Poirot said to himself thoughtfully, Yes, there it is. Ambrose Vandel, diverted from his enthusiastic account of the decor he was designing for a forthcoming ballet, supplied information easily enough. Sanderfield? George Sanderfield? Nasty fellow. Rolling in money, but they say he's a crook. Dark horse. Affair with a dancer? But of course, my dear, he had an affair with Katrina Samushenka. You must have seen her? Oh, my dear, too delicious. Lovely technique. The Swan of Tuelela. You must have seen that? My décor. And that other thing of Debussy, or is it Manine la Biche au Bois? She danced it with Michael Novgin. He's so marvellous, isn't he? And she was a friend of Sir George Sanderfield. Yes, she used to weekend with him at his house on the river. Marvellous parties, I believe, he gives. Sir, would it be possible, mon cher, for you to introduce me to Mademoiselle Samushenka? But, my dear, she isn't here any longer. She went to Paris, or somewhere, quite suddenly. You know, they do say that she was a Bolshevik spy or something. Not that I believed it myself. You know people love saying things like that. Katrina always pretended that she was a White Russian. Her father was a prince or a Grand Duke, the usual thing. It goes down so much better. Vandel paused and returned to the absorbing subject of himself. Now, as I was saying, if you want to get the spirit of Bathsheba, you've got to steep yourself in the Semitic tradition. I express it by— He continued happily. The interview that Hercule Poirot managed to arrange with Sir George Sanderfield did not start too auspiciously. The dark horse, as Ambrose Vandel had called him, was slightly ill at ease. Sir George was a short square man with dark coarse hair and a roll of fat in his neck. He said, Well, Monsieur Poirot, what can I do for you? We haven't met before, I think. No, we have not met. Well, what is it? I confess I'm quite curious. Oh, it is very simple, a mere matter of information. The other gave an uneasy laugh. Want me to give you some inside dope, eh? Didn't know you were interested in finance. It is not a matter of laissez-faire. It is a question of a certain lady. Oh, a woman. Sir George Sanderfield leant back in his armchair. He seemed to relax. His voice held an easier note. Poirot said, "You were acquainted, I think, with Mademoiselle Katrina Samoushenka?" Sanderfield laughed. "Yes, an enchanting creature. Pity she's left London." "Why did she leave London?" "My dear fellow, I don't know. Row with the management, I believe. She was temperamental, you know, very Russian in her moods. I'm sorry that I can't help you, but I haven't the least idea where she is now. I haven't kept up with her at all." There was a note of dismissal in his voice as he rose to his feet. Poirot said, "But it is not Mademoiselle Samoushenka that I am anxious to trace." "It isn't?" "No, it is a question of her maid." "Her maid?" Sanderfield stared at him. Poirot said, "Do you, perhaps, remember her maid?" All Sanderfield's uneasiness had returned. He said awkwardly, "Good Lord, no, how should I? I remember she had one, of course. Bit of a bad lot, too, I should say. Sneaking, prying sort of girl. If I were you, I shouldn't put any faith in a word that girl says. She's the kind of girl who's a born liar." Poirot murmured, "So, actually, you remember quite a lot about her?" Sanderfield said hastily, "Just an impression, that's all. Don't even remember her name. Let me see. Marie something or other. No, I'm afraid I can't help you to get hold of her. Sorry." Poirot said gently, "I have already got the name of Marie Helin from the Thespian Theatre, and her address. But I am speaking, Sir George, of the maid who was with Mademoiselle Samoushenka before Marie Helene. I am speaking of Nita Valletta." Sanderfield stared. He said, "Don't remember her at all. Marie's the only one I remember. Little dark girl with a nasty look in her eye." Poirot said, "The girl I mean was at your house, Grasslawn, last June." Sanderfield said sulkily, "Well, all I can say is I don't remember her. Don't believe she had a maid with her. I think you're making a mistake." Hercule Poirot shook his head. He did not think he was making a mistake. Marie Helene looked swiftly at Poirot out of small intelligent eyes, and as swiftly looked away again. She said in smooth, even tones, "But I remember perfectly. Monsieur, I was engaged by Madame Samoushenka the last week in June. Her former maid had departed in a hurry. Did you ever hear why that maid left?" "She went. Suddenly. That is all I know. It may have been illness. Something of that kind. Madame did not say." Poirot said, "Did you find your mistress easy to get on with?" The girl shrugged her shoulders. "She had great moods. She wept and laughed in turns. Sometimes she was so despondent she would not speak or eat. Sometimes she was wildly gay. They are like that, these dancers. It is temperament." "And Sir George?" The girl looked up alertly. An unpleasant gleam came into her eyes. "Ah, Sir George Sanderfield. You would like to know about him? Perhaps it is that you really want to know. The other was only an excuse, eh? Ah, Sir George, I could tell you some curious things about him. I could tell you—" Poirot interrupted. "It is not necessary." She stared at him, her mouth open. Angry disappointment showed in her eyes. "I always say you know everything, Alexis Pavlovitch." Hercule Poirot murmured the words with his most flattering intonation. He was reflecting to himself that this third labour of Hercules had necessitated more travelling and more interviews than could have been imagined possible. This little matter of a missing lady's maid was proving one of the longest and most difficult problems he had ever tackled. Every clue, when examined, led exactly nowhere. It had brought him this evening to the Samovar restaurant in Paris, whose proprietor, Count Alexis Pavlovitch, prided himself on knowing everything that went on in the artistic world. He nodded now complacently. "Yes, yes, my friend, I know. I always know. You ask me where she is gone. The little Samoushenka, the exquisite dancer? Ah, she was the real thing, that little one." He kissed his fingertips. What fire, what abandon. She would have gone far. She would have been the premier ballerina of her day. And then suddenly it all ends. She creeps away, to the end of the world, and soon, so soon, they forget her." "Where is she, then?" demanded Poirot. "In Switzerland, at Vagré-les-Alpes. It is there that they go, those who have the little dry cough and who grow thinner and thinner. She will die, yes, she will die. She has a fatalistic nature. She will surely die." Poirot coughed to break the tragic spell. He wanted information. "You do not, by chance, remember a maid she had? A maid called Nita Valletta?" "Valletta? Valletta? I remember seeing a maid once, at the station when I was seeing Katrina off to London. She was an Italian from Pisa, was she not? Yes, I am sure she was an Italian who came from Pisa." Hercule Poirot groaned. "In that case," he said, "I must now journey to Pisa." Hercule Poirot stood in the Campo Santo at Pisa and looked down on a grave. So it was here that his quest had come to an end, here by this humble mound of earth. Underneath it lay the joyous creature who had stirred the heart and imagination of a simple English mechanic. Was this perhaps the best end to that sudden, strange romance? Now the girl would live always in the young man's memory, as he had seen her for those few enchanted hours of a June afternoon. The clash of opposing nationalities, of different standards, the pain of disillusionment, all that was ruled out forever. Hercule Poirot shook his head sadly. His mind went back to his conversation with the Valletta family. The mother, with her broad peasant face, the upright grief-stricken father, the dark, hard-lipped sister. "It was sudden, signore, it was very sudden. Though for many years she had had pains on and off, the doctor gave us no choice. He said there must be an operation immediately for the appendicitis. He took her off to the hospital then and there. Si, it was under the anaesthetic she died. She never recovered consciousness." The mother sniffed, murmuring, "Bianca was always such a clever girl. It is terrible that she should have died so young." Hercule Poirot repeated to himself, "She died young." That was the message he must take back to the young man who had asked his help so confidingly. "She is not for you, my friend. She died young." His quest had ended, here where the leaning tower was silhouetted against the sky, and the first spring flowers were showing pale and creamy with their promise of life and joy to come. Was it the stirring of spring that made him feel so rebelliously disinclined to accept this final verdict? Or was it something else? Something stirring at the back of his brain, words, a phrase, a name? Did not the whole thing finish too neatly, dovetail too obviously? Hercule Poirot sighed. He must take one more journey to put things beyond any possible doubt. He must go to Vagré-les-Alpes. Here, he thought, really was the world's end. This shelf of snow, these scattered huts and shelters in each of which lay a motionless human being fighting an insidious death. So he came at last to Katrina Samoushenka. When he saw her lying there with hollow cheeks in each of which was a vivid red stain, and long, thin, emaciated hands stretched out on the coverlet, a memory stirred in him. He had not remembered her name, but he had seen her dance, had been carried away and fascinated by the supreme art that can make you forget art. He remembered Michael Novgin, the hunter, leaping and twirling in that outrageous and fantastic forest that the brain of Ambrose Vandel had conceived. And he remembered the lovely flying hind, eternally pursued, eternally desirable, a golden, beautiful creature with horns on her head and twinkling bronze feet. He remembered her final collapse, shot and wounded, and Michael Novgin standing bewildered, with the body of the slain deer in his arms. Katrina Samoushenka was looking at him with faint curiosity. She said, "I have never seen you before, have I? What is it you want of me?" Hercule Poirot made her a little bow. "First, madame, I wish to thank you for your art which made for me once an evening of beauty." She smiled faintly. "But also I am here on a matter of business. I have been looking, madam, for a long time for a certain maid of yours. Her name was Nita." "Nita?" She stared at him. Her eyes were large and startled. She said, "What do you know about Nita?" "I will tell you. He told her of the evening when his car had broken down, and of Ted Williamson standing there twisting his cap between his fingers and stammering out his love and his pain. She listened with close attention. She said when he had finished, "It is touching that—" "Yes, it is touching." Hercule Poirot nodded. "Yes," he said. "It is a tale of Arcady, is it not? What can you tell me, madame, of this girl?" Katrina Samushenka sighed. "I had a maid, Juanita. She was lovely, yes, gay, light of heart. It happened to her what happens so often to those the gods favour. She died young." They had been Poirot's own words, final words, irrevocable words. Now he heard them again, and yet he persisted. He asked, "She is dead?" "Yes, she is dead." Hercule Poirot was silent a minute. Then he said, "Yet there is one thing I do not quite understand. I asked Sir George Sanderfield about this maid of yours, and he seemed afraid. Why was that?" There was a faint expression of disgust on the dancer's face. "You just said a maid of mine. He thought you meant Marie, the girl who came to me after Juanita left. She tried to blackmail him, I believe, over something that she found out about him. She was an odious girl, inquisitive, always prying into letters and locked drawers." Poirot murmured, "Then that explains that?" He paused a minute. Then he went on, still persistent. "Juanita's other name was Valletta, and she died of an operation for appendicitis in Pisa. Is that correct?" He noted the hesitation, hardly perceptible but nevertheless there, before the dancer bowed her head. "Yes, that is right." Poirot said meditatively, "And yet there is still a little point. Her people spoke of her, not as Juanita, but as Bianca." Katrina shrugged her thin shoulders. She said, "Bianca, Juanita, does it matter? I suppose her real name was Bianca, but she thought the name of Juanita was more romantic, and so chose to call herself by it." "Ah, you think that?" He paused, and then, his voice changing, he said, "For me, there is another explanation." "What is it?" Poirot leaned forward. He said, "The girl that Ted Williamson saw had hair that he described as being like wings of gold." He leaned still a little further forward. His finger just touched the two springing waves of Katrina's hair. "Wings of gold, horns of gold. It is as you look at it. It is whether one sees you as devil or as angel. You might be either. Or are they perhaps only the golden horns of the stricken deer?" Katrina murmured, "The stricken deer." And her voice was the voice of one without hope. Poirot said, "All along Ted Williamson's description has worried me. It brought something to my mind. That something was you, dancing on your twinkling bronze feet through the forest. Shall I tell you what I think, mademoiselle? I think there was a week when you had no maid, when you went down alone to Grass Lawn, for Bianca Valletta had returned to Italy, and you had not yet engaged a new maid. Already you were feeling the illness which has since overtaken you, and you stayed in the house one day when the others went on an all-day excursion on the river. There was a ring at the door, and you went to it, and you saw— Shall I tell you what you saw? You saw a young man who was as simple as a child and as handsome as a god, and you invented for him a girl, not Juanita, but Incognita, and for a few hours you walked with him in Arcady." There was a long pause. Then Katrina said in a low, hoarse voice, "In one thing at least I have told you the truth. I have given you the right end to the story. Nita will die young." "Ah, non!" Hercule Poirot was transformed. He struck his hand on the table. He was suddenly prosaic, mundane, practical. He said, "It is quite unnecessary. You need not die. You can fight for your life, can you not, as well as another?" She shook her head, sadly, hopelessly. "What life is there for me?" "Not the life of the stage, bien entendu, but think, there is another life. Come now, mademoiselle, be honest, was your father really a prince or a grand duke or even a general?" She laughed suddenly. She said, "He drove a lorry in Leningrad." "Very good. And why should you not be the wife of a garage hand in a country village, and have children as beautiful as gods, and with feet, perhaps, that will dance as you once danced." Katrina caught her breath. "But the whole idea is fantastic." "Nevertheless," said Hercule Poirot with great self-satisfaction, "I believe it is going to come true." The Case of the Missing Will was first published in 1923, during a time when women's roles in society were beginning to shift. The story's protagonist, Violet Marsh, represents the new woman of the early 20th century, educated, independent, and determined to forge her own path. Agatha Christie often explored themes related to gender and societal expectations in her work, and this story is a prime example. Through Violet's determination to prove herself and Poirot's admiration for her intelligence, Christie subtly critiques the traditional roles assigned to women, highlighting the importance of education and intellectual equality. Agatha Christie, The Case of the Missing Will. The problem presented to us by Miss Violet Marsh made rather a pleasant change from our usual routine work. Poirot had received a brisk and businesslike note from the lady asking for an appointment, and he had replied asking her to call upon him at 11 o'clock the following day. She arrived punctually, a tall, handsome young woman, plainly but neatly dressed, with an assured and businesslike manner. Clearly a young woman who meant to get on in the world. I am not a great admirer of the so-called new woman myself, and in spite of her good looks, I was not particularly prepossessed in her favour. "My business is of a somewhat unusual nature, Monsieur Poirot," she began after she had accepted a chair. "I had better begin at the beginning and tell you the whole story." "If you please, mademoiselle." "I am an orphan. My father was one of two brothers, sons of a small yeoman farmer in Devonshire. The farm was a poor one, and the elder brother Andrew emigrated to Australia, where he did very well indeed, and by means of successful speculation in land became a very rich man. The younger brother, Roger, my father, had no leanings towards the agricultural life. He managed to educate himself a little and obtained a post as a clerk with a small firm. He married slightly above him. My mother was the daughter of a poor artist. My father died when I was 6 years old. When I was 14, my mother followed him to the grave. My only living relation then was my Uncle Andrew, who had recently returned from Australia and bought a small place, Crabtree Manor, in his native county. He was exceedingly kind to his brother's orphan child, took me to live with him, and treated me in every way as though I was his own daughter. Crabtree Manor, in spite of its name, is really only an old farmhouse. Farming was in my uncle's blood, and he was intensely interested in various modern farming experiments. Although kindness itself to me, he had certain peculiar and deeply rooted ideas as to the upbringing of women. Himself a man of little or no education, though possessing remarkable shrewdness, he placed little value on what he called book knowledge. He was especially opposed to the education of women. In his opinion, girls should learn practical housework and dairy work, be useful about the home, and have as little to do with book learning as possible. He proposed to bring me up on these lines, to my bitter disappointment and annoyance. I rebelled, frankly. I knew that I possessed a good brain, and had absolutely no talent for domestic duties. My uncle and I had many bitter arguments on the subject, for, though much attached to each other, we were both self-willed. I was lucky enough to win a scholarship, and up to a certain point was successful in getting my own way. The crisis arose when I resolved to go to Girton. I had a little money of my own, left me by my mother, and I was quite determined to make the best use of the gifts God had given me. I had one long, final argument with my uncle. He put the facts plainly before me. He had no other relations, and he had intended me to be his sole heiress. As I have told you, he was a very rich man. If I persisted in these new-fangled notions of mine, however, I need look for nothing from him. I remained polite, but firm. I should always be deeply attached to him, I told him, but I must lead my own life. We parted on that note. "You fancy your brains, my girl," were his last words. "I've no book learning, but for all that, I'll pit mine against yours any day. We'll see what we shall see." That was 9 years ago. I have stayed with him for a weekend occasionally, and our relations were perfectly amicable, though his views remained unaltered. He never referred to my having matriculated, nor to my BC. For the last 3 years his health had been failing, and a month ago he died. I am now coming to the point of my visit. My uncle left a most extraordinary will. By its terms, Crabtree Manor and its contents are to be at my disposal for a year from his death, during which time my clever niece may prove her wits, the actual words run. At the end of that period, my wits having proved better than hers, the house and all my uncle's large fortune pass to various charitable institutions. That is a little hard on you, mademoiselle, seeing that you were Mr. Marsh's only blood relation. I do not look on it in that way. Uncle Andrew warned me fairly, and I chose my own path. Since I would not fall in with his wishes, he was at perfect liberty to leave his money to whom he pleased. Was the will drawn up by a lawyer? No, it was written on a printed will form and witnessed by the man and his wife who live in the house and do for my uncle. There might be a possibility of upsetting such a will. I would not even attempt to do such a thing. You regard it, then, as a sporting challenge on the part of your uncle? That is exactly how I look upon it. It bears that interpretation, certainly, said Poirot thoughtfully. Somewhere in this rambling old manor house your uncle has concealed either a sum of money in notes or possibly a second will, and has given you a year in which to exercise your ingenuity to find it. Exactly, Monsieur Poirot, and I am paying you the compliment of assuming that your ingenuity will be greater than mine. But that is very charming of you. My grey cells are at your disposal. You have made no search yourself? Only a cursory one. But I have too much respect for my uncle's undoubted abilities to fancy that the task will be an easy one. Have you the will or a copy of it with you? Miss Marsh handed a document across the table. Poirot ran through it, nodding to himself. Made 3 years ago. Dated March 25th, and the time is given also, 11 a.m. That is very suggestive. It narrows the field of search. Assuredly it is another will we have to seek for. A will made even half an hour later would upset this. Eh bien, mademoiselle, it is a problem charming and ingenious that you have presented to me here. I shall have all the pleasure in the world in solving it for you. Granted that your uncle was a man of ability, his grey cells cannot have been of the quality of Hercule Poirot's. Really, Poirot's vanity is blatant. Fortunately, I have nothing of moment on hand at the minute. Hastings and I will go down to Crabtree Manor tonight. The man and wife who attended on your uncle are still there, I presume? Yes, their name is Baker. The following morning saw us started on the hunt proper. We had arrived late the night before. Mr. and Mrs. Baker, having received a telegram from Miss Marsh, were expecting us. They were a pleasant couple, the man gnarled and pink-cheeked, like a shrivelled pippin, and his wife a woman of vast proportions and true Devonshire calm. Tired with our journey and the 8-mile drive from the station, we had retired at once to bed after a supper of roast chicken, apple pie, and Devonshire cream. We had now disposed of an excellent breakfast, and were sitting in a small panelled room which had been the late Mr. Marsh's study and living-room. A roll-top desk, stuffed with papers, all neatly docketed, stood against the wall, and a big leather armchair showed plainly that it had been its owner's constant resting-place. A big chintz-covered settee ran along the opposite wall, and the deep, low window seats were covered with the same faded chintz of an old-fashioned pattern. "Eh bien, mon ami," said Poirot, lighting one of his tiny cigarettes. "We must map out our plan of campaign. Already I've made a rough survey of the house, but I am of opinion that any clue will be found in this room. We shall have to go through the documents in the desk with meticulous care. Naturally, I do not expect to find the will amongst them, but it is likely that some apparently innocent paper may conceal the clue to its hiding place. But first we must have a little information. Ring the bell, I pray of you." I did so. While we were waiting for it to be answered, Poirot walked up and down, looking about him approvingly. "A man of method, this Mr. Marsh. See how neatly the packets of papers are docketed. Then the key to each drawer has its ivory label. So has the key of the china cabinet on the wall. And see with what precision the china within is arranged. It rejoices the heart. Nothing here offends the eye." He came to an abrupt pause, as his eye was caught by the key of the desk itself, to which a dirty envelope was affixed. Poirot frowned at it and withdrew it from the lock. On it were scrawled the words, "Key of roll-top desk," in a crabbed handwriting, quite unlike the neat superscriptions on the other keys. "An alien note," said Poirot, frowning. "I could swear that here we have no longer the personality of Mr. Marsh. But who else has been in the house? Only Miss Marsh, and she, if I mistake not, is also a young lady of method and order." Baker came in answer to the bell. "Will you fetch Madame your wife and answer a few questions?" Baker departed, and in a few moments returned with Mrs. Baker, wiping her hands on her apron and beaming all over her face. In a few clear words, Poirot set forth the object of his mission. The Bakers were immediately sympathetic. "Us don't want to see Miss Violet done out of what's hers," declared the woman. "Cruel hard 'twould be for hospitals to get it all." Poirot proceeded with his questions. Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Baker remembered perfectly witnessing the will. Baker had previously been sent into the neighbouring town to get 2 printed will forms. "2?" said Poirot sharply. "Yes, sir, for safety-like, I suppose, in case he should spoil one. And sure enough, so he did do. Us had signed one." "What time of day was that?" Baker scratched his head, but his wife was quicker. "Why, to be sure, I'd just put the milk on for the cocoa at 11. Don't you remember? It had all boiled over on the stove when us got back to kitchen." "And afterwards?" "'Twould be about an hour later. Us had to go in again. 'I've made a mistake,' says old master. 'Had to tear the whole thing up. I'll trouble you to sign again.' And us did. And afterwards, master give us a tidy sum of money each. 'I've left you nothing in my will,' says he, 'but each year I live, you'll have this to be a nest egg when I'm gone.' And sure enough, so he did." Poirot reflected. "After you had signed the second time, what did Mr. Marsh do? Do you know?" "Went out to the village to pay tradesmen's books." That did not seem very promising. Poirot tried another tack. He held out the key of the desk. "Is that your master's writing?" I may have imagined it, but I fancied that a moment or two elapsed before Baker replied, "Yes, sir, it is." "He's lying," I thought. "But why?" "Has your master let the house? Have there been any strangers in it during the last 3 years?" "No, sir." "No visitors?" "Only Miss Violet?" "No strangers of any kind been inside this room?" "No, sir." "You forget the workmen, Jim," his wife reminded him. "Workmen?" Poirot wheeled round on her. "What workmen?" The woman explained that about 2 years and a half ago workmen had been in the house to do certain repairs. She was quite vague as to what the repairs were. Her view seemed to be that the whole thing was a fad of her master's and quite unnecessary. Part of the time the workmen had been in the study, but what they had done there she could not say, as her master had not let either of them into the room whilst the work was in progress. Unfortunately, they could not remember the name of the firm employed, beyond the fact that it was a Plymouth one. "We progress, Hastings," said Poirot, rubbing his hands as the Bakers left the room. "Clearly he made a second will and then had workmen from Plymouth in to make a suitable hiding place. Instead of wasting time taking up the floor and tapping the walls, we will go to Plymouth." With a little trouble, we were able to get the information we wanted. After 1 or 2 essays, we found the firm employed by Mr. Marsh. Their employees had all been with them many years, and it was easy to find the 2 men who had worked under Mr. Marsh's orders. They remembered the job perfectly. Amongst various other minor jobs, they had taken up one of the bricks of the old-fashioned fireplace, made a cavity beneath, and so cut the brick that it was impossible to see the join. By pressing on the second brick from the end, the whole thing was raised. It had been quite a complicated piece of work, and the old gentleman had been very fussy about it. Our informant was a man called Coggan, a big, gaunt man with a grizzled moustache. He seemed an intelligent fellow. We returned to Crabtree Manor in high spirits, and, locking the study door, proceeded to put our newly acquired knowledge into effect. It was impossible to see any sign on the bricks, but when we pressed in, the manner indicated A deep cavity was at once disclosed. Eagerly, Poirot plunged in his hand. Suddenly his face fell from complacent elation to consternation. All he held was a charred fragment of stiff paper, but for it the cavity was empty. "Sacré!" cried Poirot angrily. "Someone has been before us." We examined the scrap of paper anxiously. Clearly it was a fragment of what we sought. A portion of Baker's signature remained, but no indication of what the terms of the will had been. Poirot sat back on his heels. His expression would have been comical if we had not been so overcome. "I understand it not," he growled. "Who destroyed this, and what was their object?" "The Bakers?" I suggested. "Pourquoi?" "Neither will make any provision for them, and they are more likely to be kept on with Miss Marsh than if the place became the property of a hospital. How could it be to anyone's advantage to destroy the will? The hospital's benefit, yes, but one cannot suspect institutions." "Perhaps the old man changed his mind and destroyed it himself," I suggested. Poirot rose to his feet, dusting his knees with his usual care. "That may be," he admitted. "One of your more sensible observations, Hastings. Well, we can do no more here. We have done all that mortal man can do. We have successfully pitted our wits against the late Andrew Marsh's, but unfortunately his niece is no better off for our success." By driving to the station at once, we were just able to catch a train to London, though not the principal express. Poirot was sad and dissatisfied. For my part, I was tired and dozed in a corner. Suddenly, as we were just moving out of Taunton, Poirot uttered a piercing squeal. "Vite, Hastings, awake and jump, but jump, I say!" Before I knew where I was, we were standing on the platform, bareheaded and minus our valises, whilst the train disappeared into the night. I was furious, but Poirot paid no attention. "Imbecile that I have been!" he cried. "Triple imbecile! Not again will I vaunt my little grey cells." "That's a good job, at any rate," I said grumpily. "But what is this all about?" As usual, when following out his own ideas, Poirot paid absolutely no attention to me. "The tradesmen's books. I have left them entirely out of account. Yes, but where? Where? Never mind, I cannot be mistaken. We must return at once." Easier said than done. We managed to get a slow train to Exeter, and there Poirot hired a car. We arrived back at Crabtree Manor in the small hours of the morning. I pass over the bewilderment of the Bakers when we had at last aroused them. Paying no attention to anybody, Poirot strode at once to the study. "I have been, not a triple imbecile, but 36 times 1, my friend," he deigned to remark. "Now, behold!" And going straight to the desk, he drew out the key and detached the envelope from it. I stared at him stupidly. How could he possibly hope to find a big will form in that tiny envelope? With great care he cut open the envelope, laying it out flat. Then he lighted the fire and held the plain inside surface of the envelope to the flame. In a few minutes, faint characters began to appear. "Look, mon ami!" cried Poirot in triumph. I looked. There were just a few lines of faint writing stating briefly that he left everything to his niece, Violet Marsh. It was dated March 25th, 12:30 p.m., and witnessed by Albert Pike, confectioner, and Jessie Pike, married woman. "But is it legal?" I gasped. "As far as I know, there is no law against writing your will in a blend of disappearing and sympathetic ink. The intention of the testator is clear, and the beneficiary is his only living relation. But the cleverness of him! He foresaw every step that a searcher would take, that I, miserable imbecile, took. He gets 2 will forms, makes the servant sign twice, then sallies out with his will written on the inside of a dirty envelope and a fountain pen containing his little ink mixture. On some excuse he gets the confectioner and his wife to sign their names under his own signature, then he ties it to the key of his desk and chuckles to himself. If his niece sees through his little ruse, she will have justified her choice of life and elaborate education and be thoroughly welcome to his money. She didn't see through it, did she? I said slowly. It seems rather unfair. The old man really won. But no, Hastings, it is your wits that go astray. Miss Marsh proved the astuteness of her wits and the value of the higher education for women by at once putting the matter in my hands. Always employ the expert. She has amply proved her right to the money. I very much wonder what old Andrew Marsh would have thought. The King of Clubs was first published in 1923, a time when Agatha Christie was experimenting with stories that combined elements of traditional detective fiction with psychological depth. The story reflects Christie's fascination with the impact of societal expectations and personal secrets on individuals' actions. The inclusion of a clairvoyant and the symbolic use of the King of Clubs card add a layer of mysticism, which was a popular theme in the 1920s, as the public's interest in the occult and the supernatural was growing. Christie skillfully blends these elements with her signature style of logical deduction and meticulous plotting. Agatha Christie, the King of Clubs. Truth, I observed, laying aside the daily newsmonger, is stranger than fiction. The remark was not perhaps an original one. It appeared to incense my friend. Tilting his egg-shaped head on one side, the little man carefully flicked an imaginary fleck of dust from his carefully creased trousers and observed, "How profound! What a thinker is my friend Hastings!" Without displaying any annoyance at this quite uncalled-for jibe, I tapped the sheet I had laid aside. "You've read this morning's paper?" "I have, and after reading it I folded it anew symmetrically. I did not cast it on the floor as you have done, with your so lamentable absence of order and method. That is the worst of Poirot. Order and method are his gods. He goes so far as to attribute all his success to them. Then you saw the account of the murder of Henry Reedburn, the impresario. It was that which prompted my remark. Not only is truth stranger than fiction, it is more dramatic. Think of that solid middle-class English family, the Oglanders. Father and mother, son and daughter, typical of thousands of families all over this country. The men of the family go to the city every day, the women look after the house. Their lives are perfectly peaceful and utterly monotonous. Last night they were sitting in their neat suburban drawing-room at Daisy Mead Streatham playing bridge. Suddenly, without any warning, the French window bursts open and a woman staggers into the room. Her grey satin frock is marked with a crimson stain. She utters one word, "Murder," before she sinks to the ground insensible. It is possible that they recognize her from her pictures as Valerie St. Clair, the famous dancer who has lately taken London by storm. "Is this your eloquence, or that of the Daily Newsmonger?" inquired Poirot. The Daily Newsmonger was in a hurry to go to press, and contented itself with bare facts, but the dramatic possibilities of the story struck me at once. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Wherever there is human nature, there is drama. But it is not always just where you think it is. Remember that. Still, I too am interested in the case, since it is likely that I shall be connected with it. Indeed? Yes. A gentleman rang me up this morning and made an appointment with me on behalf of Prince Paul of Morania. But what has that to do with it? You do not read your pretty little English scandal papers, the ones with the funny stories. And a little mouse has heard, or a little bird would like to know. See here. I followed his short, stubby finger along the paragraph. Whether the foreign prince and the famous dancer are really affinities, and if the lady likes her new diamond ring. And now to resume your so dramatic narrative, said Poirot. Mademoiselle St. Clair had just fainted on the drawing-room carpet at Daisy Mead, you remember? I shrugged. As a result of Mademoiselle's first murmured words when she came round, the two male Oglanders stepped out, one to fetch a doctor to attend to the lady, who was evidently suffering terribly from shock, and the other to the police station, whence, after telling his story, he accompanied the police to Mont Désir, Mr. Reedburn's magnificent villa, which is situated at no great distance from Daisy Mead. There they found the great man, who by the way suffers from a somewhat unsavoury reputation, lying in the library with the back of his head cracked open like an eggshell. "I have cramped your style," said Poirot kindly. "Forgive me, I pray. Ah, here is Monsieur le Prince." Our distinguished visitor was announced under the title of Count Féodor. He was a strange-looking youth, tall, eager, with a weak chin, the famous Moronberg mouth, and the dark, fiery eyes of a fanatic. Monsieur Poirot! My friend bowed. Monsieur, I am in terrible trouble, greater than I can well express. Poirot waved his hand. I comprehend your anxiety. Mademoiselle Sinclair is a very dear friend. Is it not so? The prince replied simply, I hope to make her my wife. Poirot sat up in his chair, and his eyes opened. The prince continued, I should not be the first of my family to make a morganatic marriage. My brother Alexander has also defied the emperor. We are living now in more enlightened days, free from the old caste prejudice. Besides, Mademoiselle Sinclair, in actual fact, is quite my equal in rank. You have heard hints as to her history? There are many romantic stories of her origin, not an uncommon thing with famous dancers. I have heard that she is the daughter of an Irish charwoman, also the story which makes her mother a Russian Grand Duchess. The first story is, of course, nonsense, said the young man. But the second is true. Valerie, though bound to secrecy, has let me guess as much. Besides, she proves it unconsciously in 1,000 ways. I believe in heredity, Monsieur Poirot. I too believe in heredity, said Poirot thoughtfully. I have seen some strange things in connection with it, moi qui vous parle, but to business, Monsieur le Prince. What do you want of me? What do you fear? I may speak freely, may I not? Is there anything to connect Mademoiselle Sinclair with the crime? She knew Reedburn, of course. Yes. He professed to be in love with her. And she? She would have nothing to say to him. Poirot looked at him keenly. Had she any reason to fear him? The young man hesitated. There was an incident. You know Zara, the clairvoyant? No. She is wonderful. You should consult her sometime. Valerie and I went to see her last week. She read the cards for us. She spoke to Valerie of trouble, of gathering clouds. Then she turned up the last card, the covering card, they call it. It was the King of Clubs. She said to Valerie, Beware. There is a man who holds you in his power. You fear him. You are in great danger through him. You know whom I mean? Valerie was white to the lips. She nodded and said, Yes, yes, I know. Shortly afterwards we left. Zara's last words to Valerie were, Beware of the King of Clubs. Danger threatens you. I questioned Valerie. She would tell me nothing, assured me that all was well. But now, after last night, I am more sure than ever that in the King of Clubs Valerie saw Reedburn, and that he was the man she feared. The prince paused abruptly. Now you understand my agitation when I opened the paper this morning. Supposing Valerie in a fit of madness. Oh, it is impossible. Poirot rose from his seat and patted the young man kindly on the shoulder. Do not distress yourself, I beg of you. Leave it in my hands. You will go to Streatham? I gather she is still there at Daisy Mead, prostrated by the shock. I will go at once. I have arranged matters. Through the embassy. You will be allowed access everywhere. Then we will depart. Hastings, you will accompany me? Au revoir, Monsieur le Prince. Montdésir was an exceptionally fine villa, thoroughly modern and comfortable. A short carriage drive led up to it from the road, and beautiful gardens extended behind the house for some acres. On mentioning Prince Paul's name, the butler who answered the door at once took us to the scene of the tragedy. The library was a magnificent room, running from back to front of the whole building, with a window at either end, one giving on the front carriage drive, and the other on the garden. It was in the recess of the latter that the body had lain. It had been removed not long before, the police having concluded their examination. That is annoying, I murmured to Poirot. Who knows what clues they may have destroyed? My little friend smiled. Eh. How often must I tell you that clues come from within? In the little grey cells of the brain lies the solution of every mystery. He turned to the butler. I suppose, except for the removal of the body, the room has not been touched. No, sir. It's just as it was when the police came up last night. These curtains now. I see they pull right across the window recess. They are the same in the other window. Were they drawn last night? Yes, sir. I draw them every night. Then Reedburn must have drawn them back himself. "I suppose so, sir." "Did you know your master expected a visitor last night?" "He did not say so, sir, but he gave orders he was not to be disturbed after dinner. You see, sir, there is a door leading out of the library onto the terrace at the side of the house. He could have admitted anyone that way." "Was he in the habit of doing that?" The butler coughed discreetly. "I believe so, sir." Poirot strode to the door in question. It was unlocked. He stepped through it onto the terrace which joined the drive on the right. On the left it led up to a red brick wall. "The fruit garden, sir. There is a door leading into it farther along, but it was always locked at 6 o'clock. Poirot nodded and re-entered the library, the butler following. "Did you hear nothing of last night's events?" "Well, sir, we heard voices in the library a little before 9, but that wasn't unusual, especially being a lady's voice. But of course, once we were all in the servants' hall, right the other side, we didn't hear anything at all. And then, about 11 o'clock, the police came." "How many voices did you hear?" "I couldn't say, sir. I only noticed the ladies." "Ah. I beg pardon, sir, but Dr. Ryan is still in the house if you would care to see him." We jumped at the suggestion, and in a few minutes the doctor, a cheery, middle-aged man, joined us and gave Poirot all the information he required. Reedburn had been lying near the window, his head by the marble window-seat. There were 2 wounds, one between the eyes, and the other, the fatal one, on the back of the head. "He was lying on his back?" "Yes, there is the mark." He pointed to a small dark stain on the floor. "Could not the blow on the back of the head have been caused by his striking the floor?" "Impossible. Whatever the weapon was, it penetrated some distance into the skull." Poirot looked thoughtfully in front of him. In the embrasure of each window was a carved marble seat, the arms being fashioned in the form of a lion's head. A light came into Poirot's eyes. "Supposing he had fallen backwards on this projecting lion's head, and slipped from there to the ground? Would not that cause a wound such as you describe?" "Yes, it would, but the angle at which he was lying makes that theory impossible. And besides, there could not fail to be traces of blood on the marble of the seat." "Unless they were washed away?" The doctor shrugged his shoulders. "That is hardly likely. It would be to no one's advantage to give an accident the appearance of murder." "Quite so," acquiesced Poirot. "Could either of the blows have been struck by a woman, do you think?" "Oh, quite out of the question, I should say. You are thinking of Mademoiselle Sinclair, I suppose?" "I think of no one in particular until I am sure," said Poirot gently. He turned his attention to the open French window, and the doctor continued. "It is through here that Mademoiselle Sinclair fled. You can just catch a glimpse of Daisy Mead between the trees. Of course, there are many houses nearer to the front of the house on the road, but as it happens, Daisy Mead, though some distance away, is the only house visible this side." "Thank you for your amiability, Doctor," said Poirot. "Come, Hastings, we will follow the footsteps of Mademoiselle." Poirot led the way down through the garden, out through an iron gate, across a short stretch of green, and in through the garden gate of Daisy Mead, which was an unpretentious little house in about half an acre of ground. There was a small flight of steps leading up to a French window. Poirot nodded in their direction. "That is the way Mademoiselle Sinclair went. For us, who have not her urgency to plead, it will be better to go round to the front door." A maid admitted us and took us into the drawing-room, then went in search of Mrs. Oglander. The room had evidently not been touched since the night before. The ashes were still in the grate, and the bridge table was still in the centre of the room, with a dummy exposed and the hands thrown down. The place was somewhat overloaded with gimcrack ornaments, and a good many family portraits of surpassing ugliness adorned the walls. Poirot gazed at them more leniently than I did, and straightened one or two that were hanging a shade askew. La famille. It is a strong tie, is it not? Sentiment. It takes the place of beauty. I agreed, my eyes being fixed on a family group comprising a gentleman with whiskers, a lady with a high front of hair, a solid, thick-set boy, and 2 little girls tied up with a good many unnecessary bows of ribbon. I took this to be the Oglander family in earlier days, and studied it with interest. The door opened, and a young woman came in. Her dark hair was neatly arranged, and she wore a drab-coloured sports coat and a tweed skirt. She looked at us inquiringly. Poirot stepped forward. "Miss Oglander, I regret to derange you, especially after all you have been through. The whole affair must have been most disturbing." "It has been rather upsetting," admitted the young lady cautiously. I began to think that the elements of drama were wasted on Miss Oglander, that her lack of imagination rose superior to any tragedy. I was confirmed in this belief as she continued, "I must apologize for the state this room is in. Servants get so foolishly excited." "It was here that you were sitting last night, n'est-ce pas?" "Yes, we were playing bridge after supper when—" "Excuse me, how long had you been playing?" "Well," Miss Oglander considered, "I really can't say. I suppose it must have been about 10 o'clock. We had had several rubbers, I know." "And you yourself were sitting where?" "Facing the window. I was playing with my mother and had gone 1-no trump. Suddenly, without any warning, the window burst open, and Miss St. Clair staggered into the room." "You recognized her?" "I had a vague idea her face was familiar." "She is still here, is she not?" "Yes, but she refuses to see anyone. She is still quite prostrated." "I think she will see me. Will you tell her that I am here at the express request of Prince Paul of Morania?" I fancied that the mention of a royal prince rather shook Miss Oglander's imperturbable calm. But she left the room on her errand without any further remark, and returned almost immediately to say that Mademoiselle St. Clair would see us in her room. We followed her upstairs, and into a fair-sized light bedroom. On a couch by the window, a woman was lying who turned her head as we entered. The contrast between the two women struck me at once, the more so as in actual features and colouring they were not unlike, but oh, the difference! Not a look, not a gesture of Valerie St. Clair's, but expressed drama. She seemed to exhale an atmosphere of romance. A scarlet flannel dressing-gown covered her feet, a homely garment in all conscience, but the charm of her personality invested it with an exotic flavour, and it seemed an Eastern robe of glowing colour. Her large, dark eyes fastened themselves on Poirot. "You come from Paul?" Her voice matched her appearance. It was full and languid. "Yes, mademoiselle, I am here to serve him. And you?" "What do you want to know?" "Everything that happened last night." "But everything." She smiled rather wearily. "Do you think I should lie? I am not stupid. I see well enough that there can be no concealment. He held a secret of mine, that man who is dead. He threatened me with it. For Paul's sake, I endeavoured to make terms with him. I could not risk losing Paul. Now that he is dead, I am safe. But for all that, I did not kill him." Poirot shook his head with a smile. "It is not necessary to tell me that, mademoiselle. Now recount to me what happened last night." "I offered him money. He appeared to be willing to treat with me. He appointed last night at 9 o'clock. I was to go to Montdésir. I knew the place. I had been there before. I was to go round to the side door into the library, so that the servants should not see me." "Excuse me, mademoiselle, but were you not afraid to trust yourself alone there at night?" Was it my fancy, or was there a momentary pause before she answered? "Perhaps I was. But you see, there was no one I could ask to go with me, and I was desperate. Reedburn admitted me to the library. Oh, that man! I am glad he is dead. He played with me, as a cat does with a mouse. He taunted me. I begged and implored him on my knees. I offered him every jewel I have, all in vain. Then he named his own terms. Perhaps you can guess what they were. I refused. I told him what I thought of him. I raved at him. He remained calmly smiling. And then, as I fell to silence at last, there was a sound. From behind the curtain in the window. He heard it too. He strode to the curtains and flung them wide apart. There was a man there, hiding, a dreadful-looking man, a sort of tramp. He struck at Mr. Reedburn. Then he struck again, and he went down. The tramp clutched at me with his blood-stained hand. I tore myself free, slipped through the window and ran for my life. Then I perceived the lights in this house and made for them. The blinds were up, and I saw some people playing bridge. I almost fell into the room. I just managed to gasp out murder, and then everything went black. Thank you, mademoiselle. It must have been a great shock to your nervous system. As to this tramp, could you describe him? Do you remember what he was wearing? No, it was all so quick, but I should know the man anywhere. His face is burnt in on my brain. Just one more question, mademoiselle. The curtains of the other window, the one giving on the drive, were they drawn? For the first time a puzzled expression crept over the dancer's face. She seemed to be trying to remember. Eh bien, mademoiselle? I am almost sure, yes, quite sure, they were not drawn. That is curious, since the other ones were. No matter. It is, I dare say, of no great importance. You are remaining here long, mademoiselle? Sir, the doctor thinks I shall be fit to return to town tomorrow. She looked round the room. Miss Oglander had gone out. These people, they are very kind, but they are not of my world. I shock them. And to me, well, I am not fond of the bourgeoisie. A faint note of bitterness underlay her words. Poirot nodded. I understand. I hope I have not fatigued you unduly with my questions. Not at all, monsieur. I am only too anxious Paul should know all as soon as possible. Then I will wish you good day, mademoiselle. As Poirot was leaving the room, he paused and pounced on a pair of patent leather slippers. Yours, mademoiselle? Yes, monsieur. They have just been cleaned and brought up. Ah, said Poirot, as we descended the stairs. It seems that the domestics are not too excited to clean shoes, though they forget a great. Well, mon ami, at first there appeared to be one or two points of interest, but I very much fear, that we must regard the case as finished. It all seems straightforward enough. And the murderer? Hercule Poirot does not hunt down tramps, replied my friend grandiloquently. Miss Oglander met us in the hall. If you will wait in the drawing-room a minute, Mamma would like to speak to you. The room was still untouched, and Poirot idly gathered up the cards, shuffling them with his tiny, fastidiously groomed hands. Do you know what I think, my friend? No, I said eagerly. I think that Miss Oglander made a mistake in going 1-no trump. She should have gone 3 spades. Poirot, you are the limit. Mon Dieu, I cannot always be talking blood and thunder. Suddenly he stiffened. Hastings! Hastings! See, the king of clubs is missing from the pack. Sarah! I cried. Eh? He did not seem to understand my allusion. Mechanically he stacked the cards and put them away in their cases. His face was very grave. Hastings, he said at last, I, Hercule Poirot, have come near to making a big mistake, a very big mistake. I gazed at him, impressed, but utterly uncomprehending. We must begin again, Hastings. Yes, we must begin again. But this time we shall not err. He was interrupted by the entrance of a handsome middle-aged lady. She carried some household books in her hand. Poirot bowed to her. Do I understand, sir, that you are a friend of, Miss Sinclair's? I come from a friend of hers, madam. Oh, I see. I thought perhaps— Poirot suddenly waved brusquely at the window. Your blinds were not pulled down last night? No, I suppose that is why Miss St. Clair saw the light so plainly. There was moonlight last night. I wonder that you did not see Mademoiselle St. Clair from your seat here facing the windows. I suppose we were engrossed with our game. Nothing like this has ever happened before to us. I can quite believe that, madame, and I will put your mind at rest. Mademoiselle St. Clair is leaving tomorrow. Oh! The good lady's face cleared. And I will wish you good morning, madam. A servant was cleaning the steps as we went out of the front door. Poirot addressed her. Was it you who cleaned the shoes of the young lady upstairs? The maid shook her head. No, sir, I don't think they've been cleaned. Who cleaned them, then? I inquired of Poirot, as we walked down the road. Nobody. They did not need cleaning. I grant that walking on the road or path on a fine night would not soil them, but surely after going through the long grass of the garden they would have been soiled and stained." "Yes," said Poirot with a curious smile. "In that case I agree. They would have been stained. But have patience a little half-hour, my friend. We are going back to Mont Désir." The butler looked surprised at our reappearance, but offered no objection to our returning to the library. "Hi, that's the wrong window, Poirot," I cried as he made for the one overlooking the carriage drive. "I think not, my friend. See here." He pointed to the marble lion's head. On it was a faint, discoloured smear. He shifted his finger and pointed to a similar stain on the polished floor. "Someone struck Reedburn a blow with his clenched fist between the eyes. He fell backward on this projecting bit of marble, then slipped to the floor. Afterwards, he was dragged across the floor to the other window, and laid there instead, but not quite at the same angle, as the doctor's evidence told us." "But why? It seems utterly unnecessary." "On the contrary, it was essential. Also, it is the key to the murderer's identity, though, by the way, he had no intention of killing Reedburn, and so it is hardly permissible to call him a murderer. He must be a very strong man." "Because of having dragged the body across the floor?" "Not altogether. It has been an interesting case. I nearly made an imbecile of myself, though." "Do you mean to say it is over? That you know everything?" "Yes." A remembrance smote me. "No," I cried. "There is one thing you do not know." "And that?" "You do not know where the missing king of clubs is." "Eh? Oh, that is droll. That is very droll, my friend." "Why?" "Because it is in my pocket." He drew it forth with a flourish. "Oh," I said, rather crestfallen. "Where did you find it?" "Here." There was nothing sensational about it. It had simply not been taken out with the other cards. It was in the box. All the same, it gave you an idea, didn't it?" "Yes, my friend. I present my respects to His Majesty." "And to Madame Zara?" "Ah, yes. To the lady also." "Well, what are we going to do now?" "We are going to return to town. But I must have a few words with a certain lady at Daisymead first." The same little maid opened the door to us. "They're all at lunch now, sir, unless it's Miss St. Clair you want to see, and she's resting." "It will do if I can see Mrs. Oglander for a few minutes. Will you tell her?" We were led into the drawing-room to wait. I had a glimpse of the family in the dining-room as we passed, now reinforced by the presence of two heavy, solid-looking men, one with a moustache, the other with a beard also. In a few minutes, Mrs. Oglander came into the room, looking inquiringly at Poirot, who bowed. "Madame, we, in our country, have a great tenderness, a great respect for the mother. The mère de famille, she is everything." Mrs. Oglander looked rather astonished at this opening. "It is for that reason that I have come, to allay a mother's anxiety. The murderer of Mr. Reedburn will not be discovered. Have no fear. I, Hercule Poirot, tell you so. I am right, am I not? Or is it a wife that I must reassure?" There was a moment's pause. Mrs. Oglander seemed searching Poirot with her eyes. At last she said quietly, "I don't know how you know, but yes, you are right." Poirot nodded gravely. "That is all, madame. But do not be uneasy. Your English policemen have not the eyes of Hercule Poirot." He tapped the family portrait on the wall with his fingernail. "You had another daughter once. She is dead, madame?" Again there was a pause as she searched him with her eyes. Then she answered, "Yes, she is dead." "Ah," said Poirot briskly. "Well, we must return to town. You permit that I return the king of clubs to the pack? It was your only slip. You understand, to have played bridge for an hour or so with only 51 cards, well, no one who knows anything of the game would credit it for a minute. Bonjour." "And now, my friend," said Poirot as we stepped towards the station, "you see it all." "I see nothing. Who killed Reedburn?" "John Oglander, Jr. I was not quite sure if it was the father or the son, but I fixed on the son as being the stronger and younger of the two. It had to be one of them because of the window." "Why?" There were 4 exits from the library, 2 doors, 2 windows, but evidently only one would do. 3 exits gave on the front, directly or indirectly. The tragedy had to occur in the back window in order to make it appear that Valerie St. Clair came to Daisy Mead by chance. Really, of course, she fainted, and John Oglander carried her across over his shoulders. That is why I said he must be a strong man. Did they go there together, then? Yes. You remember Valerie's hesitation when I asked her if she was not afraid to go alone? John Oglander went with her, which didn't improve Reedburn's temper, I fancy. They quarrelled, and it was probably some insult levelled at Valerie that made Oglander hit him. The rest, you know. But why the bridge? Bridge presupposes 4 players. A simple thing like that carries a lot of conviction. Who would have supposed that there had been only 3 people in that room all the evening? I was still puzzled. There's one thing I don't understand. What have the Oglanders to do with the dancer Valerie St. Clair? Ah, that I wonder you did not see. And yet you looked long enough at that picture on the wall, longer than I did. Mrs. Oglander's other daughter may be dead to her family, but the world knows her as Valerie St. Clair. What? Did you not see the resemblance the moment you saw the 2 sisters together? No, I confessed. I only thought how extraordinarily dissimilar they were. That is because your mind is so open to external romantic impressions, my dear Hastings. The features are almost identical. So is the colouring. The interesting thing is that Valerie is ashamed of her family, and her family is ashamed of her. Nevertheless, in a moment of peril, she turned to her brother for help, and when things went wrong, they all hung together in a remarkable way. Family strength is a marvellous thing. They can all act, that family. That is where Valerie gets her histrionic talent from. I, like Prince Paul, believe in heredity. They deceived me. But for a lucky accident, and test question to Mrs. Oglander, by which I got her to contradict her daughter's account of how they were sitting, the Oglander family would have put a defeat on Hercule Poirot. What shall you tell the prince? That Valerie could not possibly have committed the crime, and that I doubt if that tramp will ever be found. Also, to convey my compliments to Zara. A curious coincidence, that. I think I shall call this little affair the adventure of the King of Clubs. What do you think, my friend?